I will now give the floor to Dr. Diego Manuel Cebreros, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Université Paris-Saclay. Um, Dr. Cebreros,
Hello. Hi,
you
everyone.
have good morning, first of all. We are
Morning.
really happy to have you on board and with a very interesting issue that you will be presenting on. I'm really happy that we have what also my good colleague Professor Antustegui mentioned, to have in our this annual conference that we're organizing every year, aspects regarding core issues of the energy transition coming from many perspectives of member states that have, of course, their peculiarities, but after all, we're talking about common challenges for the European energy market. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going just to brought you some ideas about how EVs can be, electric vehicles can be an asset to carbonize electricity systems if we adapt our regulations. So that way, my presentation will go first by talking a little bit about the opportunity of electric vehicles, then about the differences that requires an adaptation or thinking differently about the electricity systems, and what are the challenges that emerge from this process of adapting. So the opportunity is quite straightforward, is that electric vehicle batteries can be used as a source of electricity storage, which is very much needed to have electricity systems that have a high share of intermittent renewable energy, such as solar or wind. Just to give you a sense of what type of benefits electric vehicles can provide, we can look at, for example, at the CO2 emissions, the emission factors per kilowatt hour produced in California of today, which has a shift on the middle, a little valley, which shows that there are less CO2 emitted per every kilowatt hour consumed. This is mainly driven because there is a more renewable energy at this time, which are typically solar. So what can electric vehicles do is they can try to charge during the times of low CO2 emissions, or when you have a lot of renewable energy production, or even if you have excess, to charge it and store it on the on the on the electric vehicle batteries, to then discharge it during the times of peak consumption. So this is a basic idea. And this basic idea is called vehicle to grid, more standardly. And it has two main advantages for the electricity system perspective. On one hand, it is, in terms of capital investments, it is 1/20th of the cost of a battery energy storage system, which are basically the large-scale storage systems that you will have to install in case you don't have other sources of electricity storage, such as pumped storage or hydro. It also has big potentials because we are expecting to have a lot of electric vehicles. So there's a study that was done in 2023 from Nature, which basically compared the storage needs that the electricity needs until 2030 and the amount of electric vehicles that we are expecting to be introduced. And under the assumption that all electric vehicles have these bidirectional capabilities, he determines that the amount of electric vehicles alone could be enough in terms of batteries to satisfy our storage needs. If you want to think a little bit in more precise numbers, if in 2024 there were sold 70 million EVs, which represent roughly 850 gigawatt hours of storage capacity, which, to make a sense of it, is basically kind of 70% of daily electricity consumption in France. And in terms of capacity, there is almost 127 gigawatts of power capacity. Now, I don't want to get us confused that these electric vehicles that were sold in 2024, most of them are not bidirectional and are not able to seize this opportunity. So this is part of the challenges that I'm going to talk later on. However, there is also a process of adaptation. It requires us to look at electricity systems in different ways. And the way to look at it is maybe to compare what would be a 1 megawatt capacity between a stationary storage and an electric vehicle. And what is very obvious is that you need many electric vehicles to provide the equivalent of one stationary storage. And providing these many electric vehicles is going to be a key source of the challenge, because rather than managing one asset, you need to manage many assets. The second thing is that stationary storage are typically parked in one place, while electric vehicles move and most of importantly are used for mobility. So a good way to make sense of it is first to look at the process of how electric vehicles can be used as electricity storage. So typically there are three stages. The first stage is when the electric vehicle comes and gets parked, and there is a transfer of information to some scheduling algorithm. So this transfer of information is about communication on the amount of energy in the battery and how many what are the mobility needs of the EV users. Then there is an intermediate phase where you have some decision process that decides what is the best charging and discharge schedule for the EVs to perform this. But this requires several levels of components. The first thing is a hardware level. The electric vehicles needs to be equipped with bidirectional power capabilities. This is basically a modification of the onboard charger, which provides them with more controllability over the capability of discharge, not directly to the wheels, but rather through the cable back to the system. This is not necessarily an expensive upgrade, but indeed it requires an upgrade. The second one, it requires also some new levels of communication capabilities. So you need a process of recording of information within the electric vehicle and process of transmitting information, which takes us to interoperability. This information needs to be transferred either through cables by the charging station or either wireless, and needs to be interoperability of how the EV can communicate all the information that is needed for optimizing the charge and discharge time, and also the receptors, who can be different types of actors. And finally, we need information to make sure that the decision of charge and discharge do not limit EV owners' mobility, and at the same time, it is matching what the electricity system requires in terms either on prices or in emissions. For example, we will not want that electric vehicles discharge energy whenever the electric vehicle is just going to leave its parking space, or we don't want to discharge energy when there is congestion on the grid where there is maintenance. So a way to think about the opportunity and the adaptations that we need to do for using electric vehicles as decentralized storage is through these 4 levels that guarantees that the charge and discharge is actually efficient and smart. So now let's move to some of the challenges. What do we need to do for making sense, for taking advantage of this opportunity of electromobility and to decarbonize electricity systems? So the first one is quite obvious, and is that we need that the hardware is ready, which means that we need that the electric vehicles have versions or models that are bidirectional. And today there are starting to be more models, but we can only find some of them that are completely operable. And just to mention some brands, without doing any marketing, we have the Renault R5, which is bidirectional. We have Hyundai's, which are bidirectional. We have some BYDs, which are bidirectional, and many other car manufacturers who are committed to release in the next years more bidirectional vehicles. But we also need bidirectional charging stations. One of the problems of why we have less offer of bidirectional EVs or charging stations is that using electric vehicles as an energy asset requires us to make more robust certain parts of or certain components that before were not necessarily or were only thought as mobility. So, for example, if we think about an electric vehicle charging and discharging many times during the day, the amount of flow of energy that the electric vehicle battery is going to have to do changes way. It might increase a lot more to what today warranties are considered. So there is some work to do in terms of monitoring the battery state of health and trying to adapt the current warranties in order to make sure that the charging and discharge is not impacting negative what is the expected lifetime. So now there is a lot of study who have shown that the capabilities of charging and discharge do not decrease battery state of health, but we still require a monitoring to make sure that the electric vehicles are, after being used for energy purposes, are still useful for their mobility needs. So this is more an administrative and legal process of integrating the risk into the sales process of electric vehicles. We also need interoperability and data. So today, the communication between the electric vehicle and the charging station can be performed at different levels, and the level of having bidirectional capabilities requires a communication protocol, which to which we don't have in Europe a certification process that guarantees that the electric vehicle and a charging station are going to be compatible. So most of the cases that we see today of charging stations and EV that are bidirectional are typically of the same brand or the same company. So it's hard for me, for example, if I'm a Mercedes owner, to go and connect to a charging station from Renault and use it to discharge it, because there is going to be most likely an interoperability problem. Now, there is some push to create a standardized process in Europe and United States, but we are still on the early stages of this. We also need some regulation for data sharing to allow that the EVs exchange the data with the actor that is going to decide how to charge or how to discharge. And in this case, this requires the giving the capabilities of the EV owner to the EV owner, who makes sure that to the person that or the actor that is going to use their data for coordinating the charge and discharge is going to be respecting their privacy needs, and also, in first case, just to have the data portability to share it with whom they want. We also need to think about network codes. So network codes are basically the certifications that the generation assets in any electricity systems needs to respect, which, for example, includes things such as do not provide power whenever there is a maintenance on the grid, or, for example, respecting the voltage levels of the grid. In the case of electric vehicles, this is quite complex because, in contrast to some energy assets who are based on one place, this most of the assets only need one certification because they need to speak with only one system operator. But in the case of electric vehicles that move, for example, they can go from France to Germany or to the Netherlands. If they would like to do bidirectional charging in the three places, that will require that will require them to be certified at each of the system operator according to their rules. So if you think as a car manufacturer trying to provide cars that are going to be sold wide, global, or the whole of Europe, you need to make sure that your EVs are compatible with all the system operators, and this is quite costly today. So we need to harmonize the rules for network connections among Europe at first level and then globally as well. We also need to acknowledge that energy is traded through markets, and these markets have minimum bit size, so it requires a minimum size of energy that can be offered. So, for example, if it's 1 megawatt hour, it would require that someone is aggregating 80 vehicles at a time or 70 vehicles at a time. So reducing the minimum bit size allows for more markets for more market actors to be able to participate without having to require big scales. We also need to think about temporality. So there is a lead time in energy markets between the time at which you offer the energy and the time at you provide the energy. So the longer is the lead time. So for example, day-ahead markets, which are well known, have to be submitted 24 hours before, and therefore it requires predicting when the EVs are going to be available with much more time than, for example, if you are able to participate in markets of in the same day, which are intraday markets that can happen 30 minutes up to 50 minutes before time. So temporality is a key aspect for the integration of the electric vehicles. We also have the possibility of using electric vehicles to provide flexibility to the local systems. Basically, because they are located close to the sources of consumption, the electric vehicles can be module, but only if there is locational signals and if there are network tariffs that help electric vehicles or incentivize electric vehicles to respond to places of congestions. And here, what is important as well is that the network tariffs are aligned with the energy tariff. So these are two components of electricity tariff that consumers must pay. And sometimes the energy tariff represents the global performance of the system, and the network tariff can represent a local congestion. So we require an alignment between the local signals and the global signals. And we also think about business models. There's this question about metering. So whenever you want to pay a transaction, energy transaction to the EV owner, which meter you should take into consideration, the meter of the house or the meter of the EV? These differences are important because it have implications in terms of losses and in terms of the revenue that the EV owner might receive. There is an important discussion about taxes, because if consumers have to pay for TVA, for example, for sales tax, and they have to charge and discharge several times during the day, the margin or the difference between the discharge price and the charge price needs to be significantly enough, or increases this difference with the taxes, if there are taxes at the consumer level. So this is an important issue. And finally, how to divide the value between EV owners. These are many questions about how can these services be transparent so that the value that is created is divided fairly with the EVs. And just to finish, I just want to let you know that there is a lot of advances on this over these last years. There are 4 new types of business models that have emerged, performing vehicle to grid for any EV owner who owns a specific electric vehicle that is bidirectional. So this is shown that we are starting to advance in the right direction, but there are many things that we still need to resolve for every electric vehicle be able to be bidirectional at least, and to take out the maximum opportunity of the electric mobility transition. Thank you.
It was indeed very interesting, Mr. Cebreros, and I don't just mention that because I have to, but because I do believe that. Perhaps I found it so interesting because I must say, although I have spent, let's say, at least the last 25 years of my academic life focusing, of course, on the legal aspects of energy regulation. And that is why this interdisciplinary approach always is very helpful. I must say that I didn't have such an accurate perception of the role that electric vehicles can play in, let's say, the overall framework of difficulties and challenges that the electrical systems here in Europe face. And it was indeed very insightful.